The first bullet struck the dirt 10 yards in front of them, snapping into frozen ground with a sound so sharp and sudden that several men instinctively dropped flat before they even knew why. For a moment, no one moved. The patrol had been walking to the shallow valley in relative quiet, boots pressing into damp soil, equipment clinking softly as a late afternoon wind drifted through the hedgerows. The front line was supposed to be miles ahead. According to the briefing maps folded in Lieutenant Harris's jacket pocket, the area they were crossing had already been cleared 2 days earlier. Enemy forces had withdrawn toward the next ridge, leaving the stretch of farmland firmly inside friendly lines. Yet the bullet that had just snapped past them did not care about maps. Another crack split the air a second later. This one struck a tree trunk behind the column, scattering bark in a spray of pale splinters. The men flattened instinctively, their training taking over before thought could catch up. Rifles swung toward the tree line to the north where the sound seemed to originate, but the shapes beyond the hedges were impossible to read. Smoke from distant artillery drifted low across the fields, blurring distance and turning every movement into a shifting silhouette. Someone muttered that the Germans must have slipped through during the night. It would not have been the first time. Front lines in the war rarely behaved the way maps suggested they should. But even as the assumption spread quietly through patrol, something about the gunfire felt wrong. The rhythm of it carried a strange familiarity. The weapon sounded like an American M1 rifle rather than the harsher bark of a German Mauser. A third shot followed, then a fourth, each one measured in discipline, fired with the calm spacing of trained soldiers working from cover. Sergeant Walker crawled forward beside Harris and pressed his helmet lower against the cold dirt. He listened carefully between the shots, trying to judge distance. The sound was not echoing off the valley walls the way enemy fire usually did. It came from a fixed direction, steady and deliberate. Harris slowly removed the folded map from his jacket and spread it across the ground between them, holding the edges down against the wind. Their patrol route was marked clearly in blue pencil, a thin line cutting across the valley toward Crossroads Village that had supposedly been secured the previous afternoon. According to the map, friendly infantry were positioned on the far ridge beyond the fields. Between here and there should have been nothing but abandoned farmland. Yet the shots continued, each one striking close enough now that the dirt trembled against their sleeves. One round passed over their heads with a thin, tearing whistle that made several men press their faces deeper into the soil. The patrol had begun to spread out along the shallow ditch beside the road, forming a rough defensive line. Rifles were pointed toward the trees, but no one fired back yet. Harris raised a hand, signaling restraint. If enemy soldiers were indeed in that tree line, revealing their position too quickly could make things worse. Still, the sound of those rifles gnawed at him. He had heard it 1,000 times on training ranges back in the States. The tone, the mechanical rhythm of the semi-automatic action, the sharp metallic echo that followed each shot. It sounded like their own weapon. Walker seemed to be thinking the same thing. He leaned closer, voice barely louder than the wind moving through the hedges. He said the firing pattern felt disciplined, almost cautious, the kind of controlled engagement drilled into American infantry units trying to conserve ammunition while probing an uncertain target. Harris said nothing for several seconds. Another shot struck the edge of the ditch, spraying mud across the sleeve of a soldier lying beside them. The man cursed under his breath and pressed his helmet tighter against his head. Now the space in between shots shortened slightly, as if the unseen riflemen were adjusting their aim. Someone farther down the line shouted that he saw movement among the trees. The words passed down the ditch in urgent whispers. Enemy contact seemed the only explanation that made sense. Yet Harris kept staring at the map. The location of the firing point matched almost perfectly with a position marked in blue pencil. A friendly machine gun team had been assigned to watch the northern approach during the previous night's advance. According to the report, they should have shifted forward hours ago, redeploying toward the ridge. But battlefield reports traveled slowly and maps aged quickly. Units moved faster than the information meant to track them. Dust, exhaustion, and broken radio lines could have stored an entire front in the span of a few hours. Harris felt a cold uncertainty settle in his stomach as another round tore through the branches overhead. If the machine gun team had not moved when headquarters expected them to, then from their perspective this patrol might look exactly like an approaching enemy force emerging from the valley floor. The patrol uniforms were smeared with mud from the march, their helmets shadowed by the lowering sun. At this distance, details would blur into shapes and motion. Harris imagined a nervous gunner behind a sandbag position squinting through drifting smoke, seeing figures moving across open ground, and making the only decision that training allowed. Fire first. Ask questions later. War rewarded hesitation with death. Harris slowly lifted his helmet, just high enough to look toward the distant tree line again. The shadows there remained impossible to read, broken only by the faint flicker of muzzle flashes appearing briefly between branches. Each flash was followed by the unmistakable crack of an American rifle. A round in patrol remained pressed against the ditch, breathing hard, fingers tightening around their own triggers as the possibility none of them wanted a voice began settling quietly into every mind. The patrol remained pinned in the shallow roadside ditch as the firing continued in irregular bursts from the tree line across the valley. At first, the men had believed the situation might resolve quickly, that a shouted signal or a visible gesture would correct whatever misunderstanding had formed in the smoke-filled distance. But the battlefield rarely offered such simple solutions. Every second that passed seemed to deepen the confusion spreading across the quiet farmland. The crack of rifles was no longer the only sound drifting through the hedgerows. Farther east, somewhere beyond the low hills, artillery had begun to fire again, its distant thunder rolling across the ground in slow, heavy pulses that vibrated faintly through the soil beneath their elbows. The men in the ditch could not see the guns responsible for those explosions, but the pattern of fire suggested an artillery battery adjusting its aim, shifting targets according to information moving through command channels miles away. Those adjustments were being made based on reports that might already be hours old. On a battlefield where front lines could change in minutes, outdated information had a way of turning careful planning into chaos. Lieutenant Harris pressed the field radio handset closer to his ear, trying to separate the voice of battalion command from the static that flooded the receiver. The signal came and went in fragments, sometimes fading entirely as the wind shifted, or as another transmission somewhere along the line drowned out the weak frequency they were trying to use. Harris spoke slowly into the microphone, describing their position and the unexpected fire coming from the northern trees. His voice sounded strangely calm even to himself, though he could feel tension building in the tight muscles of his neck. The operator at headquarters answered with only pieces of clear information. Other units were moving across the same valley from different directions, and several patrols had reported uncertain enemy activity inside areas believed to be secured. The message that finally reached Harris was cautious and incomplete. Hold position if possible, confirm visual identification before engaging, and wait for clarification about nearby friendly movements. Waiting felt like the most difficult order of all. In the ditch beside him, the soldiers shifted uneasily, boots scraping against damp soil as they tried to keep their bodies low without losing sight of the fields ahead. Every man knew that hesitation could be dangerous, yet firing blindly toward the trees risked escalating a mistake that none of them fully understood. Another shot cracked across the valley, striking the stone wall behind their position. The bullet ricocheted with a shrill metallic whine before disappearing somewhere down the road. The sound made several men flinch, their fingers tightening instinctively around rifle triggers. Sergeant Walker crawled along the ditch, speaking quietly to each soldier he passed, reminding them to hold their fire until the situation became clearer. His voice carried the steady tone of a man who had spent months learning how quickly battlefield panic could spiral into something far worse. The land itself seemed to conspire against clarity. Smoke from distant shell impacts drifted across the valley floor, forming a pale curtain that moved slowly with the wind. In some places it thinned enough to reveal the outlines of barns and broken fences scattered across the farmland, but a moment later it would thicken again, turning those shapes into indistinct shadows. The afternoon sun hung low behind the haze, casting long, slanting beams of light that made movement difficult to judge. A soldier standing upright might appear only as a flicker of motion before vanishing again into drifting smoke. In conditions like this, even trained observers could misinterpret what they were seeing. Reports continued to filter through the radio in fragments. Somewhere along the western ridge, an infantry company had advanced faster than planned, pushing beyond its assigned boundary while chasing a retreating enemy element. To the south, another unit had paused unexpectedly when its lead vehicles encountered a damaged bridge. Both movements altered the positions that commanders believed existed on their maps. None of these details alone seemed dramatic, yet together they created a battlefield where friendly formations were no longer neatly separated by the careful lines drawn during morning briefings. Instead, they drifted unpredictably through the same spaces, sometimes separated only by a hedgerow or a shallow rise in the land. The patrol in the ditch began to understand that they might be caught in the middle of this shifting puzzle. If another American unit had taken up defensive positions in the northern trees, they would be scanning the valley for signs of enemy movement just as carefully as Harris and his men were doing now. From their perspective, figures crawling through the ditch might look like German soldiers attempting to flank their position. The possibility hung heavily in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. Farther down the road, a brief burst of automatic fire erupted, rattling sharply through the valley before fading as suddenly as it began. The sound came from somewhere beyond the smoke to the west, suggesting that another group of soldiers had encountered the same confusion unfolding here. Harris lifted his head just enough to see over the lip of the ditch. Through a gap in the drifting haze, he caught a glimpse of movement near the far hedgerow. Dark shapes crossing open ground in hurried strides before disappearing again behind a stand of trees. He could not tell whether they were enemy troops maneuvering through the fields or friendly soldiers repositioning under pressure. The distance and smoke erased every detail that might have answered the question. Around him, patrol remained motionless, listening to the scattered echoes of gunfire moving across the valley. The battlefield had begun to feel less like a defined front line and more like a maze of overlapping movements, where certainty was impossible to maintain. In this environment, every decision carried weight. A soldier raising his rifle might be defending himself from an approaching enemy or firing unknowingly at a man wearing the same uniform. Radios continued to hiss with broken messages. Artillery thunder rolled across the distant hills, and smoke drifted endlessly across the farmland as both sides struggled to understand what was happening inside the fog of war. The firing from a northern tree line began to slow as the afternoon wore on, not because the uncertainty had been resolved, but because the soldiers on both sides of the valley were growing cautious. Ammunition was never wasted lightly, and even the most nervous rifleman eventually paused long enough to reassess what he believed he was seeing. In the ditch beside the road, Lieutenant Harris could sense that the men around him were listening more carefully now, their attention shifting away from the instinct to shoot and toward the subtle sounds that might reveal who was actually moving through the smoke-covered fields. The valley had fallen into an uneasy rhythm where isolated shots echoed across the farmland, followed by long stretches of tense silence. It was in those quiet moments that fragments of understanding slowly began to reach them. The field radio crackled again, louder this time as the signal briefly strengthened. Harris pressed the receiver tightly against his ear, while the operator at battalion command relayed new information gathered from units scattered across the sector. Reconnaissance patrols had reported that several American formations had advanced beyond their assigned objectives during the morning push. What had begun as a carefully coordinated movement across the front had gradually accelerated once German resistance weakened. Small groups of soldiers pressed forward through hedgerows and open fields, eager to secure ground before the enemy could reorganize. In many cases, those advances were successful, but they also carried the units beyond the positions marked on the maps used by artillery observers and nearby patrols. The lines that commanders believed existed no longer matched the reality on the ground. Harris listened in silence as the radio operator continued. One particular report caught his attention immediately. A machine gun section from another infantry platoon had established a defensive post in the northern tree line earlier that afternoon after moving ahead of the main company. Their orders had been to watch the valley road for signs of German withdrawal. According to their own reports, they had seen several unidentified figures approaching from the south through drifting smoke and broken farmland. Believing the shapes might belong to a retreating enemy force attempting to regroup behind friendly lines, they had opened fire at a distance rather than risk allowing the unknown soldiers to close the gap. The explanation arrived without drama, spoken to the static of the radio in the same calm voice used for every other battlefield update. Yet for the men lying in the ditch, the meaning of those words settled heavily into the air. The rifle fire that pinned them down for nearly an hour had not come from hidden German troops slipping through their lines. It had come from American soldiers who believed they were defending their newly captured position. Sergeant Walker leaned closer as Harris lowered the handset. Neither man spoke immediately. The quiet around them felt different now, as though the battlefield itself had shifted tone once the truth became clear. A few soldiers along the ditch had begun to realize the same possibility. Their expressions carried a mixture of relief and unease. Knowing the source of fire removed one kind of fear, yet it replaced it with another realization that was difficult to ignore. The bullets that had snapped past their heads moments earlier had been fired by men wearing the same uniform, trained in the same camps, and fighting under the same flag. The explanation made sense when viewed through the slow accumulation of battlefield mistakes. The patrol had followed orders based on a map printed the previous night, a map that still showed the northern tree line as territory recently abandoned by German forces. Meanwhile, the machine gun section position there had advanced farther than expected during the morning push, moving into ground that higher command still believed was contested. Communication between the two elements had broken down almost immediately after the advance began. Field radios were unreliable in the hedgerow country, their signals blocked by terrain and scattered vegetation. Runners sent to relay information often took hours to navigate roads damaged by shell fire or choked with supply traffic. By the time Harris's patrol entered the valley, the situation had already drifted far beyond what any single map or report could accurately describe. From the perspective of the machine gun crew in the trees, unidentified soldiers were approaching from a direction where enemy forces had last been observed. From Harris's position in the ditch, rifle fire was erupting from a location marked as friendly territory on his map. Each side reacted exactly as their training instructed them to react when faced with uncertainty in combat. Neither group had acted recklessly. Both had simply trusted the limited information available to them. Another radio transmission arrived moments later, confirming the mistake. Battalion Command had finally connected the scattered reports from across the sector and was issuing instructions for both units to cease fire and identify themselves clearly before moving again. Harris signaled to his men to remain low while he stood slowly from the ditch, raising a cloth signal panel above his head, where it could be seen across the valley. The bright square of fabric caught the fading sunlight as it moved gently in the wind. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a voice shouted faintly from the northern tree line. The words carried unevenly through drifting smoke. The machine gun team had seen the signal. Their rifles lowered as they stepped cautiously out from behind their sandbag position, equally aware now how close the misunderstanding had come to turning into something far worse. The valley grew quiet again as both groups of soldiers studied one another across the open ground. The tension that had filled the afternoon did not disappear immediately. It lingered in the stiff movements of men who had spent the last hour believing they were under attack. Yet the silence carried a different meaning now. The truth had finally surfaced from the confusion that had hidden it, revealing how easily the machinery of war could turn even disciplined decisions into tragedy when information failed at the worst possible moment. The valley slowly returned to a quiet that felt almost unnatural after the tension of the afternoon. Smoke still drifted through the hedgerows, but the sharp cracks of rifle fire had stopped, replaced by the distant rumble of artillery somewhere beyond the hills. Lieutenant Harris lowered the signal panel and stepped back down into the ditch, where the men of the patrol remained crouched in the damp soil. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The realization of what had happened hung over them in a silence thicker than the drifting haze that covered the farmland. The danger had passed, yet the relief that usually followed a successful escape from enemy fire did not fully arrive. Instead, there was a quieter emotion spreading through the group, one shaped by the knowledge that the bullets they had dodged had never been meant for them. Across the valley, the machine gun section began moving cautiously out from the trees. Their figures emerged slowly through the fading smoke, rifles slung low as they crossed the open ground toward the road. They looked much the same as Harris's patrol, mud-streaked uniforms, tired faces, helmets carrying the dull scuffs of weeks spent moving through hedgerows and shell-torn fields. The distance between the two groups closed gradually until they stood facing each other near the roadside ditch. For a moment, the soldiers studied one another with an awkward mixture of recognition and embarrassment, as though meeting strangers who had accidentally collided in the dark. The leader of the machine gun team removed his helmet and ran a hand through sweat-damp hair before offering a brief explanation. From their position in the tree line, they had watched shapes move through the valley without any clear sign of identification. Their radios had stopped working shortly after they set the gun, leaving them cut off from the rest of their company. Earlier reports had warned that small German units might still be slipping to the countryside after the morning's retreat. When the patrol appeared through the smoke, moving low across the fields, the shapes looked exactly like what those warnings had described. The machine gunner had done what every soldier was trained to do when faced with uncertain movement near his position. He had opened fire. Harris nodded as he listened. The explanation required no defense because it followed the same reasoning he had already traced in his own mind while lying in the ditch. On a battlefield shaped by incomplete information, every decision depended on assumptions that might be wrong by the time they were made. Maps were printed based on yesterday's intelligence. Radio transmissions struggled against terrain and interference. Units advanced faster or slower than planned, leaving gaps between expectation and reality. In the space between those gaps, mistakes could grow quickly. The two groups remained together for several minutes, exchanging brief details about their movements during the day. Each piece of information revealed another small misalignment that had contributed to the confusion. The machine gun section had been ordered forward after the German withdrawal earlier that morning, but the report of their new position never reached command post responsible for directing patrol routes through the valley. Meanwhile, Harris's patrol had begun its movement based on a map that still showed the northern trees as empty ground. Neither side had known the other was operating in the same space until the first shots were already in the air. As evening approached, runners from battalion headquarters finally arrived along the road carrying updated orders. Both units were instructed to reposition closer to the main line before darkness fell. Before leaving, Harris watched as a machine gun crew dismantled their position among the trees, stacking ammunition boxes and folding the heavy tripod into a canvas carrier. Their movements were efficient but subdued. The excitement of combat had faded, replaced by the quieter understanding that the encounter had come dangerously close to producing casualties among their own ranks. Later that night, the incident would appear only briefly in official reports. Officers would rewrite the day's movements on fresh maps, adjusting the lines that marked where each company had actually been during the afternoon. Communications failures would be noted and procedures reviewed, but the explanation would remain simple on paper. A patrol had entered a sector where friendly forces had advanced unexpectedly. A defensive unit had mistaken them for enemy troops. Fire was exchanged until identification was established. No casualties were reported. Yet for the soldiers who had crouched in the ditch listening to familiar rifles snapping past their heads, the experience carried a deeper weight than the report could describe. They had seen how easily the machinery of war could misdirect its force when visibility failed and information arrived too slowly. The battlefield did not pause to confirm identities or verify coordinates. It demanded immediate action from men forced to judge danger through smoke, distance, and fear. Scenes like the one in that valley were rarely discussed once a campaign moved forward. The war produced countless stories of courage and victory that commanders preferred to highlight when describing the progress of their armies. Friendly fire, by contrast, lived in a quieter space within military history. It was not born from betrayal or carelessness, but from the complicated reality of modern warfare, where thousands of soldiers, vehicles, and weapons moved across landscapes too vast for any single headquarters to monitor perfectly. Throughout the conflict, similar misunderstandings unfolded in forests, across rivers, and along narrow country roads where advancing units crossed paths without warning. Artillery shells sometimes landed short when coordinates were misread. Fighter pilots occasionally attacked columns they believed belonged to the enemy. Each incident carried its own chain of small errors that aligned at the worst possible moment. For the men who lived through those experiences, the memory remained long after the battlefield quieted. They carried with them the knowledge that war blurred the boundaries meant to separate friend from foe. In the confusion of smoke, noise, and urgency, danger could appear from any direction, even from the lines meant to offer protection. It was a reality that soldiers rarely spoke about openly, yet it lingered quietly in their understanding of the war they had fought, a reminder that the chaos of battle spared no one from its reach.